I plan to start a series involving a dichotomy of the two types of women married to notorious American-born serial killers. I will discuss the ones who marry after the fact, meaning after their convictions, and the ones who were married to them during their killing sprees, the oblivious wives, and the outcome of their stories. If you are interested in this upcoming project, make sure you visit and subscribe to my channel. Also, get notified by ringing the notifications bell so you will know when the content is available. And always feel free to like, comment, and share. So why are convicts allowed to get married in prison? According to jail administrative policies, officials recognize that inmates have a fundamental right to marry that is not extinguished as a result of incarceration. And the first case that dealt with prisoners obtaining the rights to marry was the 1987 Supreme Court decision, Turner v. Safely ruling, that gave prisoners the fundamental right to marry under the U.S. Constitution. Turner v. Safely dealt with and argued that two prison policies that restricted communication between correspondence between inmates and banned inmate marriage as unconstitutional was ultimately ruled that prisoners have a fundamental right to marry under the U.S. Constitution. The court ruled that a regulation preventing inmates from marrying without permission violated their constitutional right to marry because it was not logically related to a legitimate penological concern, but a prohibition of inmate-to-inmate correspondence was justified by prison security needs. In the late 1970s, two people serving time at the same prison formed a relationship at the Rennes Correctional Institution, a medium to maximum security level prison in the state of Missouri that in the 70s had recently began housing both men and women. Leonard Safely was a male inmate and P.J. Watson was a female inmate, and both were incarcerated at Rennes, where the two met and became romantically involved. However, once this was discovered, Watson was transferred to Ozark Correctional Center, and prison authorities rejected all of Safely's attempts to directly contact Watson. Safely filed an action against the superintendent of Rennes, William Turner, and others for injunctive relief and damages. At the time, a Missouri Division of Corrections regulation permitted correspondence between inmates who were immediate family members, but correspondence between inmates who were not family was only allowed on certain conditions, such as if it related to legal matters, at the discretion of the classification and treatment team of both inmates, and another regulation only permitted inmates to marry with the permission of the prison superintendent and specified that permission should only be given when there was a compelling reason to do so. For example, an inmate who was pregnant or who had already given birth. The district court certified plaintiffs as a class including inmates at Rennes who desired to correspond with inmates at other prison facilities. This class also included persons who wished to marry inmates at Missouri correctional facilities and whose right to marry had been allegedly violated by the Department of Corrections. The question involved in this case was the Missouri Department of Corrections restriction limiting correspondence between inmates a violation of those prisoners' First Amendment rights? And was this restriction limiting prisoners' ability to marry a violation of their constitutional rights to marry? The district court applied strict scrutiny to both Department of Correction restrictions. It held that the restriction on correspondence was overly broad and capriciously applied, and that the marriage restriction violated an inmate's constitutional right to marry and violated their fundamental rights under the U.S. Constitution, thus allowing prisoners to marry. The United States Court of Appeals, 8th Circuit, affirmed, further holding that neither restriction was the narrowest means of addressing the Department of Corrections' security concerns. In the end, a 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court upheld the Missouri Department of Corrections restriction on correspondence between inmates, and Justice O'Connor held that it was an unconstitutional violation of an inmate's fundamental right to marry. It's probably fair to ask, why do these women even want to marry notorious killers? There is a term for women who marry men behind bars, Hybristophilia, meaning someone who feels aroused by being with a partner who has committed serious crimes. Most people who become involved in death row or lifer inmate romances start by exchanging letters, like the case of Doreen Leoy and Rich Ramirez, who after 11 years and around 75 love letters, he proposed to her from death row, and the two married years later in 1996 on the grounds of San Quentin State Prison near San Francisco. I mean, I have heard of falling for the bad boy syndrome, but this is beyond extreme, and most likely these women are attracted to them from the media's portrayal that generates the fame. Perhaps in their fantasy world of living, if they can't marry an actual famous celebrity, then the next best thing, and probably the easiest for them to accomplish, is to marry an infamous murderer. These women that fall for serial killers after they have been caught and convicted seem to have a warped sense of attraction and suffer from the delusion, convincing themselves that these men are innocent and that they can come in and save them, while the ones who are married unknowingly to their husband's second life as a serial killer become extremely shocked and instantly file for divorce once their husbands are caught. Like Pamela Dietz did when she was granted an emergency divorce from Dennis Rader, also known as the BTK killer, with the judge even waiving the normal 60-day waiting period. Some of the most infamous serial killers I plan to cover are Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, who married Doreen Lioy on prison grounds, a former Tiger Beat magazine editor who, because of her job, allowed her to meet celebrities like John Stamos, who even credited Doreen with helping him become a celebrity, and after finding out later that she married Ramirez, he actually quoted, "To be that lonely that this is the only man on the planet that she can find, I just thought, how horrible. This man is the personification of evil, just a monster." I will also tell you about Ted Bundy, also known as the co-ed killer, who during the penalty phase of his trial proposed to and married an old friend named Carol Ann Boone inside a Florida courtroom, in which she was convinced of his innocence. These two even managed to have a child while he was locked away in prison, even though conjugal visits were not allowed. Go figure as to how that happened. Back in the mid-80s, after the arrest of Ramirez, he was seen as the fan favorite of this group of women, basically his groupies. I guess they were attracted to his wickedness, his long hair, the fact he was tall and dark, including his dark soul. He wore sunglasses during court, and apparently at some point even received prison dental care. These women seemed to ignore the fact of who he was and the magnitude of his vicious crimes. Some even supported his evilness, while others just stayed blind. Even Ted Bundy's looks was what most likely lured some of his victims to their deaths. He had a trusting face and often faked an injury so they would feel more sympathy to a man who looked like him. Couldn't possibly be a serial murderer. You will also learn about the unfortunate women who were unknowingly married to serial killers like Dennis Rader and Herb Baumeister. Both women divorced their husbands after learning of their second lives as moonlighting serial killers. I honestly believe some of these women were living in a world of delusion to marry into evil matrimony, and the only way they could do this was to convince themselves their husbands were innocent of some of the worst murder cases in history. It was more of an infatuation or obsession than it was love. To compare these two types of wives, the ones who were already married unknowingly to serial killers at the time obviously loved the men they married, only to find out later in the most shocking way to find out who they were. And the ones who found immediate attraction the second these infamous killers went to trial, the groupies, the soon-to-be wives of some of these killers, most likely married out of infatuation, delusion, and even the chance for notoriety themselves. So you have the rational women running away from their marriages the second they found out they married a killer, and the delusional ones running toward. However, in most of these cases, even the ones who married serial killers ended up at some point abandoning their marriages either by separation or divorce. And those reasonings will be discussed in detail in the series. The notorious killers and their wives and families that I plan to discuss are Richard Ramirez, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Dennis Rader, Gary Ridgway, Keith Hunter Jesperson, Herb Baumeister, and Charles Manson. While not really a serial killer, but more of a cult leader who influenced the family to do his bidding, nonetheless just as evil. So please be sure to subscribe and stay notified so you will know when these series of videos will become available. Thanks everyone.